Back when I was completing my master's degree, I had to share an apartment with someone to keep the costs down. After putting out an ad on Facebook, I received a message from a guy called James. I started out looking for a roommate, terrified that I ended up living with some psychopath, but the person I found ended up being my longest and closest friend. One of the things we immediately bonded over was our mutual love of long-distance hiking. He first mentioned it on the phone when I asked what his hobbies and interests were, and after that, we spent about a half hour sharing experiences and enthusing over the great outdoors. We went on our first trip during spring break of 2004, and it was pure bromance, if you catch my drift. James was like a brother from another mother, and although we both moved elsewhere following the completion of our studies, we made sure to keep in touch via social media and online games. Then on top of that, we headed out on some long-distance hike together either once or twice a year. We used to go real hard back when we still had the knees and ankles for it, and our choices of destination tended to be extremely remote. Most of our friends who joined us would blister up their heels for a few days with us and then say never again on the ride back. So for the most part, the trips tended to be just me and him. We both ticked off Baxter State Park and the Adirondacks while we were both living in the Northeast. Then after James moved down to Virginia, we visited both Shenandoah and the Great Smoky Mountains. But then as time went on, we started pining for somewhere a little further afield, if you catch my drift there as well. And that's how we settled on heading out to the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, or more specifically, the Cloud Peak Wilderness. The Cloud Peak Wilderness is the centerpiece of a roadless block of land that's almost 200,000 acres in size, making it one of the single largest wilderness areas in the entirety of North America. If ever we were going to get the full Lewis and Clark experience, it was there. So late one spring, we met up in a small town called Buffalo before heading out into the mountains. The Cloud Peak trip happened in 2013, and we were both pretty experienced outdoorsmen by that point. So at first, marching off into the trees just felt like business as usual. It was only around 24 hours in that we realized that we were a day's walk from the nearest highway, meaning we were almost completely cut off from civilization. I'd been to some far-flung places before, but there was something different about being out in Cloud Peak. Areas like the Appalachian Trail feel wild, but they're roads more traveled, if you will, whereas out in Cloud Peak, it felt as if though we were crossing over some dangerous frontier. In light of that, we remained cautious and careful as we progressed along our route. But as the days went by and the fatigue started to set in, we began to get more confident and much more explorative. James was carrying an old Colt 45, having obtained the necessary permits to do so, so we weren't particularly worried about bears or any other variety of wildlife. What we were worried about was our dwindling water supply. In order to walk the vast distances that we tended to cover, we kept our water supplies minimal in order to maintain mobility. You could always find a stream or creek to top up your canteens mid-journey, whereas trying to lug gallons worth of water just wasn't an option if you wanted to cover any serious ground. Every other hiking trip, we'd had no problem finding water, and we'd even plan our routes to leapfrog from water source to water source. But then late April of 2018 turned to be unlike any other I can remember, and it completely sent our plans askew. It was hot, real hot, and as much as it made for great tanning weather, days upon days of unseasonably high temperatures meant a lot of our water sources were too shrunken and stagnant to be safe. Each one we passed, we got more and more desperate, until in the end, we just about jumped for joy when we came across a fast-flowing mountain stream. We filled our canteens as much as possible, but we knew the rest of the hike would be pretty hellish unless we got some serious rain. If we wanted to make it out of the wilderness without risking heat stroke, we needed to be conservative, resourceful, and a little bit lucky. We managed the first two. The third, not so much. On day 6 of a planned 9-day hike, we were once again in dire straits in terms of our water supplies. You can always tell when things are getting really bad when your pee starts to look like Bacardi Dark, and Although we really didn't want to, it was looking like we might have to cut the hike short to make a beeline to the nearest convenience store, which by that point was going to be a day and a half's hike at least. We pushed on, and at one point we're walking along some barely carved out trail when we decided to stop for a water break. We sipped, and I mean sipped, at our half-filled canteens. Then James walked off to take a leak up against a tree. He walks out of sight, and then the next thing I hear is like a high-pitched yap or bark, the kind you hear out of a fox or coyote. The next thing I hear is James saying, "Jesus Christ," as if the bark had suddenly spooked him. Honestly, I thought the whole thing was pretty funny, some hardened hiker getting scared by some furry woodland creature. So I picked myself up and headed off in the trees to make fun of him. I found James alone and visibly shaken, fastening up his pants while looking up at the slopes above us. Given the high-pitched noise the animal made, I figured it was something small and fairly harmless, so the fact that James was so spooked made the sight all the more amusing to me. I asked him what it was that he saw, be it a fox or a coyote or what have you, and he tells me no, that it wasn't an animal that made the noise. It was a boy. A boy that had then scurried off into the trees after scaring him half to death. After a touch more humiliation on my part, James started wondering aloud what a kid would be doing out there all alone, and to me, the answer was fairly obvious. The kid wasn't alone. It couldn't have been. He was probably out here camping with his family or something, and he just stumbled across some hiker taking a leak while out playing. I guess we skipped a few logical steps given how thirsty we were, because all I could think about was finding their camp so we could beg for some water. If they had kids, chances are that they'd be good folks willing to share a little H2O with us, in which case we'd be all set until the next reliable natural source. James, on the other hand, he didn't seem to think that it was a good idea at all. I thought he was crazy. We had a golden opportunity to resupply our water and maybe get a little hot food out of it too, and there he was, second-guessing the whole thing. When I asked him why he was so nervous, he replied, and I quote, "I think there's something wrong with that kid." I took this to mean that the kid had maybe learning difficulties or something like that, but I also knew that James wasn't so backward as to be freaked out over something as simple as a disability. Then, when I asked what he meant by wrong with the kid, he just went quiet before agreeing to go look for the kid's parents. I just figured that he changed his mind, that his rational brain took over and accepted that we needed water. I didn't stop to think about what he'd seen might have actually scared the life out of him, even if it was just a kid. James pointed us in the direction the kid ran off. Then we trudged up the hill in the hopes of finding his parents. After a few minutes of walking, dense forest opened up into a football field-sized clearing, and on the other side of it stood this ancient-looking log cabin. From where we were standing, I was pretty sure that I could see someone little on an old porch swing that was sat out front. This was great news. Our problems were solved. At least, that's the way I saw it. James was still reluctant to approach them. He didn't say it. You could just see it in his face as we slowly walked towards the cabin. As we got closer, I realized the person on the porch swing was very old. Like so old it didn't look like they ever really left that swing. They were also, and I don't mean to sound so judgmental, I know time comes for us all, the single most facially disadvantaged person I had ever laid eyes on, and that's putting it as politely as I possibly can. I figured it was all down to some kind of medical condition, but when I politely asked if they had any water to spare, someone emerged from the cabin, and the proverbial penny dropped. Neither person had a chin to speak of. Both wore big, thick glasses, and both had this completely blank stare that seemed to bore right into you. The person who walked out of the cabin was holding a small dog, and although they were short enough to be mistaken for a kid, they had to be in their late teens to early 20s. Then, right as we made eye contact, he barked at me. I think my eyebrows must have shot up to my hairline as I turned to James, who was already slack-jawed and gawping as if to say, "It's him. I told you." I remember stammering the beginning of something, then just stopping when I realized these people simply weren't going to talk to us. Not even because they weren't willing to either, but because they just couldn't. Something you also have to understand is that the barks didn't sound voluntary. They sounded like ticks, like something he didn't have any control over. I started to talk to them both real slow, like you talk to a child or something, telling them, "Hi there. We need some water. Could you get some water from your house? We'd be super grateful if you..." The dog the man-child was holding barked right as I was trying to talk, and then the man-child himself barked even louder. It pains me to admit it, but I started to get really nervous when the man-child walked back inside the house. He moved with purpose, like he was going to get something, and I said a small silent prayer that thing wouldn't be loaded, if you get my drift. Me and James were both wound up like springs waiting for him to reappear, but when the door opened again, it wasn't the barking man-child who appeared. It was someone so strikingly different looking that I was actually dumbstruck for a second. It was a girl. A younger girl, probably in her early to mid-teens, and unlike the rest of her family, she acted relatively normal. But when it came to her looks, they were beyond striking. She looked like she could have been a child star or something. She had this jet black hair and these bright amber eyes, both in stark contrast to the sandy blonde hair and pale blue eyes of her relatives. She could also talk, albeit in extremely broken English, and made that clear before I could even introduce myself by asking, "What you want, mister?" She was much more receptive to our request for water and invited us inside to fill up our canteens from a water tank that they kept in their kitchen, or at least would pass for a kitchen. The inside of the house was filthy, with junk and trash covering almost every available surface, and the water inside the tank the girl referred to did not look like drinkable whatsoever. We started searching the cabinet for any kind of bottled water, being more than prepared to pay well over regular sale price for whatever we could find, but the little dark-haired girl interrupted our search, embarrassing us in the process. I started to explain that we were just looking for soda or bottled water, anything to quench our thirst, but the girl just told us, "You need to leave." When we asked why, she explained that her daddy had arrived home and that he didn't like strangers. For a moment, James seemed to find some courage, possibly on account of how close we were to resupply, so he walked out of the kitchen and back down the short hallway in the direction of the home's front door. The next thing I hear is a bark much similar to the one the man-child had emitted, only this one was much louder and much deeper. I too moved in the direction of the hallway, my heart rate climbing rapidly as I did so, but I was cut off by James, who had a terrified look on his face. All he said was "run." A second later, he lunged past me in the direction of a screen-covered back door, then after he opened it, we went tearing out the back of the house and into the woods. The whole time I could hear this huge daddy person screaming and shouting in complete gibberish, probably furious that his family had allowed strangers into the house. Had we been wearing our heavier packs, we would have been screwed, but since we were traveling relatively light, we didn't have to put down our packs to go in the house to collect water. If we'd had to, we'd have left them out front with the family, meaning we'd have no choice but to confront Daddy to retrieve them. I didn't get a look at the guy, but James did, and when I asked him to describe the guy, he used but one word: monster. He certainly sounded like it to me from the noises he was making, and I'm grateful to this day that we didn't have to deal with him. The only problem we were left with then was our original one, and after having ran full pelt for a sustained period, we needed water more than ever. We walked a little further north, just running on pure adrenaline by that point when, out of nowhere, we heard the sound of rushing water. Whatever water that family lived off, it most probably came from there, and chances were that Daddy saw it as part of his property. We moved fast to collect water, so we didn't exactly have time to celebrate the stream's discovery at the time. All that came later, once we were at a safe distance. We were able to complete the remainder of the hike, and by the end of it, the incident with the house in the middle of nowhere had already become a kind of campfire story-style anecdote. It was definitely unnerving to see the condition those folks were in, and downright scary when we realized that we were inadvertently trespassing in the home of a furious giant. But those parts aren't what stuck with me after we got home and went on with our lives. After having talked about the whole thing with James during the remainder of our hike, we came to a very depressing conclusion. The family had probably been living there a long time and most likely refused to move after the region was declared a wilderness area. There was also a really good chance that there had been some interbreeding in the family, most likely going back generations considering the condition they were in. At least, everyone except the girl. She looked so unlike her relatives that after a while I started to suspect that she wasn't related to them at all. And this is where I started to go down a rabbit hole of sorts. I did a ton of research into inbreeding in the United States, and as you can probably figure, it makes for some pretty horrifying reading. I'm not going to share all of the deeply unsettling stuff that I've learned, just 2 little tidbits that I think might be relevant. Number 1 is that historically speaking, inbreeding in the rural United States happened out of necessity. Some families were simply too isolated or unwilling to give up a family member capable of farm labor. For the most part, second cousins would wed second cousins, but sometimes, in more disturbing cases, brothers would wed sisters or fathers would lay with daughters. But even someone comfortable with such a perversion knows that there are limits to how far you can push a small gene pool, which is undoubtedly what led to nasty rumors of kidnap and forced breeding. I read multiple accounts of this, some more reliable than others, but it definitely seems to be a thing among isolated or reclusive families and tribes all over the world. After hours of research, the situation seemed obvious to me, but after failing to find any kind of missing persons report that might correlate with the girl we'd seen at the cabin, I decided to contact the police out in Buffalo to see if they knew anything about the family living out near Cloud Peak. The first officer I spoke to claimed no knowledge of them and insisted that permanent housing wasn't permitted in any of the state's wilderness areas. He explained that we must have gotten lost and wandered onto someone's land and rudely dismissed the idea of me and James being capable navigators. I had to repeatedly request a phone conversation with the town's chief of police to get any kind of clarification, but when it came, it only raised more questions than it answered. The day I finally got him on the phone, I was actually out running errands, so I had to pull over to the side of the road in order to talk with him. I was practically shaking with anticipation when he told me that he'd already heard my story, and when he asked me if I was a journalist, I had a pretty good feeling that I was about to finally get to hear the truth. I told him no, that I wasn't a journalist, and that everything he told me would be completely off the record. I also made it clear that I simply wanted to reassure myself that whatever I'd witnessed wasn't the result of some hideous case of kidnapping, as I didn't want my lack of action to plague me for the rest of my life. And that's when he gave me the respect enough to admit that there really was a family living out near Cloud Peak, and that yes, their family tree had indeed included some questionable choices of mate. However, there was no evidence that the little girl had been kidnapped. At least, there had been no missing persons reports that would suggest that that was the case. Instead, Buffalo's police department, as well as those in other towns around Cloud Peak, had all come to a general consensus. It was common knowledge among certain folk that there was a family living up near Cloud Peak, and there had been for generations. The region was only declared a wilderness area in 1984, and records showed that the authorities had offered the family a large monetary sum to vacate the property. The offer received no reply. The chief of police then told me that a handful of cops and low-level politicians then paid the family a visit, hoping to personally persuade them to leave their land. The only details of this visit are a vague report of a refusal, then after that, there's no mention of the family in any of Johnson County's official records. Instead, the truth of their continued existence evolved into a sort of urban legend, and encounters with the family got so rare that they're now dated by decade. And despite how unusual and unsettling they could be, they didn't cause any trouble, so folks just left them alone. As for the girl, it was the opinion of regional law enforcement that she was something of a genetic miracle. Somehow, someway, the family's genetic stagnation had resolved itself, resulting in an angelic little girl with hair as dark as coal dust. No one knew how, and no one knew why, but until anyone could prove otherwise, the girl was just part of the family, just as her yapping man-child of a brother or her monster of a father. And that was the official story. And when it came to me questioning it, the chief of police just didn't want to know. The last thing he wanted was some East Coast city boy prodding at old wounds, and he made that politely but perfectly clear to me before we amicably ended the call. I called James immediately, and we talked for hours and hours, arguing back and forth, taking turns to play the devil's advocate to each other's harebrained ideas. I'm not claiming that we're ultra-astute investigative journalists or whatever, and at no point did we agree on how and why that little girl came to be there. But this is the theory that haunts me some nights when the podcasts aren't enough to keep the bed dread at bay. I think, deep in my heart of hearts, that Buffalo's chief of police knows darn well that that little girl was taken. I think every other cop in the area knows it too, but keeping it a secret serves a grander purpose. The man that girl called Daddy was always going to snatch someone, specifically someone female, in order to inject his family tree with some fresh blood. Now, that female could have been a relative of any of those police officers, or anyone else in the surrounding towns for that matter. So to prevent that, I think someone facilitated the trafficking of a child to that family. As me and James discussed, there's no way in God's green earth that any state adoption agency would allow custody of a child to those people. So to prevent them from just taking someone, arrangements had to have been made. Granted, I have absolutely no way of proving my claims, and like the chief of police told me, there might well be an innocent explanation for the whole thing. But at this stage, I honestly think it would be remiss of me to not dig a little deeper. I plan to return to Cloud Peak to find out what's become of that little girl. If she's still there, maybe I'll get a chance to talk to her, find out if she has any memories of a time before. I have plans to write a book about my experience along with what I find out there. Maybe this will serve as a kind of first draft, who knows. I'm excited about it, I won't lie, but I'm scared too. Part of me thinks that if I actually find my way back to that cabin in the woods, I'll never be seen alive again. Back in the day, I used to work for the National Trust up in Scotland. It was a really lonely job, with a lot of it spent either driving long distances or walking around the highlands in dire weather conditions. At work, I used to drive around this big 4x4, but off-duty, I had to use my own car, which was absolutely crap. So this one Saturday, I planned to drive back down to England for my mom's birthday. Me and my boyfriend had this whole big thing planned for her. I'd drive down in the morning, help get set up, then I'd go and pick Mom up for the big surprise. I was massively excited about it, and massively confident that my mom would be over the moon with it. What I wasn't confident about was the ability of my poor little Nissan Micra to get me there without giving me trouble. I was driving through the highlands, absolute arse end of nowhere and all, and the engine started making some really unhealthy noises. I pulled over to the side of the road, but I couldn't work out what was wrong. I thought I'd be able to get it to a garage and risk being a little bit late, but when I got back in my car and tried starting it up again, nothing. The engine was trying to turn over, just never coming to life, and no matter how hard I tried or what little tricks I tried to pull, I just couldn't get the car to start. These days, I'd have just pulled up an app and had a bloke out for repairs or a tow within an hour or so. But back then, in the age of flip phones and spotty mobile reception, breaking down in the middle of nowhere could be a huge pain in the bottom. I tried the engine a few more times while mentally preparing myself to actually get out and walk. This was in the middle of November, by the way, so it was absolutely freezing as it was, but then the Highland gales meant the idea of walking anywhere was grim beyond belief. I fought it for as long as I could, but in the end, I fastened up my coat, whacked on my hat and gloves, and got out of my car to face the cold. The plan was to walk to the nearest anything, which hopefully had a phone or someone capable of engine repairs, but then no sooner had I started walking, but a car suddenly appeared in the distance. Each side of the road was lined with trees, and the road kind of snaked off in the distance, so the car's appearance took me by surprise at first. I actually said a prayer to myself that Whoever it was would pull over for me, and when they did, I thought those prayers had been answered. But at the risk of sounding a bit melodramatic, I don't think it was God that answered my prayers that day, rather than his opposite number downstairs. Anyways, the car pulls over and this quite friendly-looking middle-aged man rolls down the window and asks if I'm all right. I explain the situation, tell him where my car is, and he says that depending on how bad the damage is, he might be able to get his mate to come and fix it on the cheap. I just about danced a little jig that I was so happy. Then he invites me into his car and gives me a lift back to mine. We made a bit of small talk after I noticed his English accent, and we both swapped stories explaining why we were both up in Scotland. After we pulled up behind my car, he pulled out his mobile and started texting someone, apparently the person who was going to come fix my car. When I asked him, he explained that up in the Highlands, it was much better to send texts with that little signal you could muster. It was a little slower in terms of response time and all, but the message actually went through loud and clear instead of garbled and spotty. He told me not to worry though, as his mechanic friend worked Saturdays and was probably close to a phone. Those of you in your 20s might not remember the ritual of holding your plastic brick of a phone high above your head to try and force a text message through, but after a minute or so of that, my Highland Samaritan assured me that the text had both been received and read. Everything was looking hunky-dory. All I had to do was to be patient and hope for the best. Within a few minutes, the kind stranger's phone had buzzed, and he reported that his mate was on the way, although he wouldn't be arriving for another 20 minutes or so. 20 minutes I could deal with, and if the guy could get me to my mom's surprise party on time, the one I'd spent a month planning, I was willing to give him everything I had in my wallet. But then, as I sat waiting with the bloke, still making the same small talk, I noticed that he changed some minor detail in his story. I won't bore you with the ins and outs of it, but he basically told me his business was in one place, and then about 10 to 15 minutes later, he told me it was based somewhere else. I didn't jump on the sudden change of detail or anything. I mean, a business can have more than one branch, can it? And people misspeak all the time, so I'm not exactly going to act all Sherlock Holmes on a bloke who's supposedly doing me a favor, am I? That was the first red flag, you might say. One I didn't really acknowledge until after the event itself. It was only the second that actually caught my attention. After a brief lull in the conversation, the man asked if anyone was expecting me. He used that exact same phrase too, expecting you. And I must have given him a funny look or something because he clarified with, have you got any plans later? I started telling him about my mom's party, how I'd been planning it for ages, how my whole family expected me to be there. And instead of showing any interest or enthusiasm whatsoever, he sort of nodded and started staring off into the distance like he was thinking about something. That wasn't what got me, though. It was how he'd phrased the question. Was anyone expecting me? And then considering he was apparently just bringing his mate to fix my car, and I hadn't heard what they'd said to each other. It all added up to a really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Call it a woman's intuition, but I knew I had to do something, anything to try to get ahead of what I feared the most. I asked the guy how long his mechanic friend is going to be, and after his long and contemplative state, he snapped right back into his friendly. He checked his phone and then told me, "It seems like it's only going to be a few more minutes." So I put my little plan into action. I told the bloke that I had to grab a few things from my car just in case it needed a tow or I had to go anywhere, then slipped out of his car and walked towards my own. Once I was there, I put on a show of looking for things, and when what I was doing in actual fact was delaying time until his mechanic friend arrived. If it was some bloke in overalls driving his work van, then yeah, I probably had nothing to worry about. But anything else, I'd put phase 2 of my plan into action. I kept at it for a few minutes, fishing around for absolutely nothing while keeping my eyes glued to the road behind us. Then lo and behold, a big white van comes from around the bend a few hundred yards behind us, then starts pulling in behind the stranger's car. The van was all white, no marking on it at all, and it looked brand new. On top of that, there were 2 people sitting in the cab, not just one as I'd been expecting. Like I said, if everyone's intentions were good, then me acting a bit paranoid wasn't going to do anyone any harm. The mechanic and his friend might think that I was a bit weird, but weird I can live with. What I couldn't live with was the feeling I was walking into some kind of trap. The moment the van started to pull in behind the stranger's car, I hurried back to him and told him something like, I'm just gonna nip for a wee. I'll be back in a few. At that, I scurried off into the trees at the side of the road and kept myself crouched and out of sight as if I was actually having a wee. But in actual fact, I'm just watching the seemingly kind stranger and his friends to make sure that they didn't have anything planned. I stayed where I was, telling myself I wouldn't move until I got a good look at the two blokes who'd just pulled up in the van. But the minutes ticked by and no one moved. Eventually, I heard the stranger's voice calling me from the side of the road. He sounded friendly at first, and just let me know that the blokes were working on my car. Only thing was, I could see a bit of my car, and there was no one standing near it. I still felt like I was going half mad at this point, that I'd gotten myself into a tizzy and had completely overreacted. Then, right as I told myself that I was gonna feel very silly after this if the guys really were there just to fix my car, the stranger's tone of voice changed dramatically. That alone sent a chill through me, but what truly terrified me was when he used my name. At no point in our conversation had we ever swapped names or introduced ourselves formally. I know that sounds a bit mental, since I was sitting with the bloke for the better part of a half hour, but my mind was on other things, and evidently his was too, because he never bothered to introduce himself either. I know there's always a chance that I let it slip during our chat and just not remembered it, but I certainly didn't know his name, which made it all the more frightening when he told me to show myself. He made it clear that if I didn't, it wouldn't be good for me, and that I might actually get to my mum's party on time if I just did as he told me. Squatting down among the clump of trees, trying to stay out of sight of those not-so-benevolent strangers, they made for the scariest few moments of my entire life. I didn't think it was possible to get any more frightened than that, but I was wrong. Suddenly, I heard an engine start up, but I knew from how healthy it sounded that it wasn't mine. The next thing, I see the stranger's car drive off, and that's the first stranger who picked me up, not the two strangers in the van. I thought that might mean that the van was about to drive off too, so I poked my head out from behind the trees a wee bit to get a better look. That's when I see a man, wearing a balaclava, walking through the trees with his head on a swivel like he's searching for me. Remember what I said about being wrong regarding how scared I could be? I can actually remember most of the stuff that happened, but after seeing that guy in his mask, quite obviously searching for yours truly, my memory actually gets a bit spotty. I know I just ran, further and faster and harder than I ever ran in my life. I remember being sick a bit when I couldn't run any further, and I remember many cars passing me before a driver finally bothered to stop to see if I was actually okay. I also remember being frightened out of my wits that the first stranger or the guys in the van would come across me, but thankfully that didn't happen. Instead, I was driven to a police station where I gave a statement. After that came a trip to a mechanic's, which resulted in me finding out my car wouldn't be roadworthy for at least 24 hours. After that, I got a room and a bed and breakfast, got myself a late lunch, then cried on the phone to my mom up in my room. I actually think it was the single worst day of my life. I let my mom down, had to dip into my savings to pay for engine repairs, and it was just a complete nightmare of a day. And to top it all off, I almost got kidnapped or murdered as well. I just didn't think things like that happened in real life, or if they did, I certainly didn't think it had ever happened to me. I was able to give a really detailed description of the first guy along with what car he was driving, but as for the other two men, I didn't have much to say aside from what their van looked like. The police promised that they'd do all they could, and they even got the first guy in for questioning. But given that he hadn't actually broken any laws, they were unable to charge him with anything. The police had asked him about the masked men in the white van, but he just claimed he didn't know what they were talking about. According to him, he tried to do a favor to a young woman whose car had broken down, and the next thing, she's off into the woods in a blind panic. They let him go, but I know he was involved in it, and I know he only let me see his face because he thought I was a done deal. But if that's the case, how many other women and girls have his tactics worked on? And that's the thought I find myself living with after all these years. I can be thankful and grateful and whatever else I can be that I didn't end up a victim that day. But I can't be the only one. There have to be more. Girls who didn't get away. And it haunts me to wonder where they are now. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. In the mid-1980s, 4 very different women were abducted and murdered in rural Texas, in a place that came to be known as the Killing Fields. On the surface, the women had little in common. One was just a teenager, another was a local bartender, the third was a 30-year-old mechanic, while the fourth was a young unemployed mother. Yet despite their differences, their lives all ended in the same place, in a rural field just off a dirt road near League City, Texas. The area surrounding League City was once a desolate and barren place, with the only landmarks being the occasional oil rig, the perfect place to bring a person if you didn't want anyone to hear them scream. On October 10th of 1983, a pretty blonde bartender by the name of Heidi Fye disappeared while walking the short distance home from a convenience store. 6 months later, her lifeless body was found in the Calder oil fields. Due to the fact that there were contusions around Heidi's wrists and major fractures in her ribs and skull, a medical examiner concluded that she had been bound, tortured, then beaten to death with some kind of blunt object. There was very little in the way of forensic evidence at the scene, and without any witnesses to the kidnapping itself, the investigation into Heidi's murder ground to a halt, and the case eventually went cold. Just over 2 years later, on February 2nd of 1986, 4 young cyclists were riding through the Calder oil fields when they suddenly detected the scent of death. Upon further inspection, they discovered that the source of the foul odor were horribly decomposed remains of a young woman. After rushing to inform some adults of their find, the police were summoned and they opened up an investigation into the woman's death. Since it proved impossible to identify the victim, she was declared a Jane Doe, but was described as being in her mid-20s, around 5'7", with reddish-brown hair and a distinct gap in her teeth. The cause of death was a single shot to the back, one which sent a bullet tearing through her heart and lungs, and her body was found just 50 yards from where Heidi Fye's was found. Then, when the police were still in the process of examining the initial crime scene, they came across another dead body, that of 16-year-old Laura Miller, who had vanished on September 1st of 1984. When police dug out the file detailing her disappearance, they discovered something chilling: that Laura Miller had been abducted from the same convenience store that Heidi Fye had been walking home from when she vanished. By 1991, the murders of all 3 of the aforementioned women remained unsolved when a 4th body was found in the Calder oil fields. Unlike Fye and Miller, who were both positively identified through their dental records, the limited scientific options of the era meant that both unidentified bodies would remain so until the middle of 2019. While the League City Police Department remains responsible for the investigation, the FBI has often loaned its considerable resources to beleaguered local law enforcement. Their dedicated laboratories have pored over forensic evidence, while expert behavioral analysis created a psychological profile of the potential killer. Yet despite their hard work, leads have come and gone, evidence remains inconclusive, and the murders remain unsolved. There are no known witnesses to any of the killings, and no common person connects all 4, yet, although the choice of victim is seemingly random, law enforcement seems certain that a lone serial killer is to blame. Although the prospect of multiple murderers cannot be ruled out, the nature of the location in which the bodies were found, it was likely someone with roots in the area. As one prominent FBI investigator explained, someone must have been very familiar with those fields if they knew such an effective spot to hide a body. Investigators have scoured missing person databases and appealed to the public for tips, but with each passing year, the case gets harder and harder to solve. Special Agent Richard Renison, who has worked the Calder Road killings case out of the FBI's Houston field office, has echoed this sentiment. With that much time going by, people lose their memories, Renison said. People pass away, people just simply forget. It's hard to remember significant details from that long ago. Over time, the murders went from a professional curiosity to a deeply personal mission. Agent Renison is actually from League City and began his heady rise in law enforcement with the League City Police Department in 1993. As we know, Agent Renison later graduated to the FBI, and due to his deep ties to the Calder Road area, he became the case agent for these killings back in 2005. While the avenues of investigation have narrowed over the years, law enforcement technologies have advanced significantly, and in January of 2019, Agent Renison received a call that gave new hope to his apparently lost cause. One of the Jane Doe corpses found in 1986 was discovered to belong to a woman named Audrey Lee Cook. Cook had worked as a mechanic in the Houston, Channelview, and Heights areas of Texas and was last seen in December 1985. The 1991 Jane Doe, however, was determined to be Donna Ghuslin Prudhomme. The belated identification of the bodies has finally given law enforcement something to work with, and as of 2019, agents were contacting the victims' friends and neighbors while reviewing police records from the period. However, when a key part of any investigation is appealing to the public for help, progress isn't promising. Agent Renison, as well as local police, have requested to talk with anyone who can provide additional information, and in cases like these, it could be something as simple as where the woman worked or the names of friends who haven't been interviewed that are the key to solving these murders. When interviewed by a local TV station, Laura Miller's father, Tim, said his daughter had big talent and big dreams and refused to let her epilepsy become an obstacle to her aspirations. She was popular at high school and even maintained a romantic relationship with a high school classmate, but at some point, the Miller family packed up their lives and moved out to League City. Laura was quietly devastated by the decision. She had to leave her friends, her boyfriend, and her beloved choir behind, and she struggled socially following such a sudden move. What made matters worse is the fact that, for almost a week following the move, the phone in the Millers' home had yet to be connected. It meant that the incredibly lonely young woman had no means of contacting the friends she so desperately missed, at least no means to contact them from her new home. On September 10th of 1984, Laura's mother drove to a nearby payphone so she could call her boyfriend. Since the weather was so nice, Laura planned to walk the half-mile back home once she was done. When Laura failed to return home, her parents were quick to report her missing, but at the time, police considered her to be a runaway on account of her severe homesickness. Law enforcement told the Millers not to worry, that they'd do everything that they could to find their daughter and would be in touch as soon as there'd be any developments. But as month after month went by, it became increasingly clear that Laura was not coming home. Yet instead of intensifying their investigation, law enforcement began to allocate resources elsewhere. In their view, Laura was most probably dead, in which case it was only a matter of time before her body was discovered. Out of frustration, Tim Miller began researching similar disappearances in the area. What he discovered was horrifying. Over the previous decade, 15 other young women had disappeared in the region. Some were still missing, others remain unidentified following the discovery of their corpses, but not a single woman's killer had ever been identified. I knew in my heart that Laura wasn't coming home alive. I was afraid she was never going to be located, her father later said. But just over a year after her disappearance, Laura's body was found. The Millers had to wait 17 months to learn of their daughter's fate. Diane Gonslin Hastings, on the other hand, had to wait more than 30 years to find out what happened to her sister Donna. Donna and Diane grew up in the Port Arthur area of Texas. Donna later married and had 2 sons, but when her husband became abusive, she was forced to flee the marriage with her 2 boys in tow. She had a pretty tough life, her sister explained, but she loved her children so much. We just did the best we can with what we had. By the late 1980s, Donna was raising her sons with a stepfather in League City, but kept in touch with her family often while assuring them that she was happy. But after that relationship ended, Donna fell on hard times. She took her children to their grandmother's house and moved to Clear Lake, Texas, to try to rebuild her life and one day take her children back, her sister said. In 1989, Donna asked her sister for a copy of her birth certificate so she could obtain a passport. Diane mailed the birth certificate to Donna's home in Clear Lake, but after that, she was never heard from again. Donna's family rationalized her absence by assuming that she was traveling overseas. But when her absence dragged on for months at a time, people began to worry for her safety. They reached out to Donna's close friends and associates, but when they discovered that not a single one had seen or heard from her, they approached law enforcement to report her missing. Years went by, and Donna's sons grew up without her. Then one day, tragedy touched the family once again. Her eldest son was paralyzed in a devastating traffic accident. He spent the remainder of his life requiring almost constant medical supervision, and sadly, he passed before his mother's remains could be properly identified. In 2008, and against the advice of her own family, Donna's sister began working with a private investigator. Some believed that she simply moved away to start a life anew somewhere else, yet others were convinced that Donna would never just abandon her children. In 2019, those that had faith in her as a mother were proven right. The 1991 Jane Doe from the Calder oil fields was confirmed to be Donna, and although her family finally got the closure they deserved, they were heartbroken to have their worst fears confirmed. Much like Tim Miller, Donna's sister had also put a great deal of time into researching the Killing Fields murders, and although she's been horrified by the scale of them, she's accepted there's very little she can do about it. "We gotta move forward with our lives," she explained. "I can't just get into the justice part of it because for me, it's about healing our family." The area around the Calder oil fields has been developed considerably since the time of the murders. Encroaching residential spaces mean that it's only a matter of time before every inch of the killing fields had been dug up and examined by all manner of inspectors and tradesmen. Perhaps there are even more bodies to be uncovered on the killing fields, just waiting for someone to stumble across them. A brand new church was recently constructed in the area, with community members putting together a peace garden in memory of the 4 women who've been positively identified. Each victim has her own marker decorated with their photos, names, and mementos. "We really claimed that area and we got plans for more," said Laura Miller's father. "We're changing the name of that place from the Killing Fields to the Healing Fields, and we're actually going to build a little park there." As for FBI agent Richard Renison, the Killing Fields are the only cold case he's worked that remains unsolved. As he approaches retirement age, Agent Renison hopes to finally finish what has become his life's work, for the victims' families, the wider community, and for himself. "Anything the public knows, no matter how small they think it is, we really want them to come forward because it may be very significant to us," he told one local media source. "It's important for the public to know that we have not given up. It may be labeled a cold case, but that doesn't mean it's sitting on a shelf. It's being worked actively at the FBI and actively at the League City Police Department. This isn't over, and we're not giving up." Many years ago now, me and my best friend from high school decided to go on a Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas-style road trip through Nevada. It was almost identical to the movie we'd grown up idolizing, with the only major differences being the total lack of hallucinogens and the fact that we didn't go anywhere near Las Vegas. For us, it was more about just cruising through the desert, jamming out to mixtapes, than getting weird with whatever beer or grass our meager supply of cash could get us. It made for a pretty good time at first. We hit up some wild places and met some even wilder people, and that was just the first day of our road trip. We planned to stay on the road for about a week or so, and given how well it went that first day, we were real excited to find what the rest of our journey had in store for us. At the end of the first day, we were still very much in the middle of nowhere, so we just pulled onto a back road, found ourselves a dried-up riverbed for concealment, then laid out 2 bedrolls under the stars to catch some shut-eye on. It might sound crazy, but I think that was the best night's sleep I'd ever gotten. And the next morning, both me and my old high school buddy were raring to go. I put on my boots, then got to giving myself a baby wipe shower while my buddy had his morning smoke and drank some water. Then out of nowhere, I hear him curse. Then I hear him curse louder, like he's obviously in pain. Then when I turn around, he's lying on his bedroll, holding one of his ankles with both hands with an expression like he just took a red-hot poker up his butt. I asked him what was wrong, and he just kept saying, I don't know, it was my boot. I look over to the boot that was closest to him, lying on its side in the dust, and I swear to God, right as I'm looking at it, wondering if he might have gotten some broken glass in it or something, some huge scorpion comes crawling out of it and scuttles off across the sand. Now, we're from Wisconsin. We knew nothing about scorpions, so you could have shown us the most benign little scorpion ever and we both would have been like, deadliest scorpion in the world. But my buddy's screams made it clear that this was no ordinary sting. We used to skateboard together, a whole lot during all the summers that we had in high school. Both of us had taken some really bad falls during that time, and we were both very well accustomed to pain. I'd seen my buddy take some pretty nasty hits and just get up without so much as a grunt. But after that scorpion stung the bottom of his foot, he was literally in tears from how bad it hurt. My first thought was to just get him in our car so I could get him to a hospital. So I tried to help him find his feet, but the pain was so bad that he literally could not move his leg. I basically had to drag him up, grimacing and groaning, then help him hop to my car to get him into the passenger seat. The things that were coming out of his mouth had me scared beyond belief. It hurts so much, dude. I can't feel my leg. We need to get to a hospital soon, man. Oh, I don't want to die. All things you never want to hear out of another human being, let alone your best friend. That kind of fear meant that I drove faster than I ever have in my life. Dangerously fast. The way I saw it, my buddy had minutes before his organs were about to turn to mush, so I had no choice but to drive as fast as I could. When I saw it, I actually did a double take just to make sure that my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. But there it was, bold as brass, a cop car zooming up behind me with its lights and sirens on. I don't know how I managed to avoid getting shot, because the second I pulled over, I jumped onto the driver's side and started screaming at the officer that my buddy needed a hospital right away. The cop was incredibly edgy at first and drew down on me as I held shaking hands above my head. I just kept repeating, "My friend needs a doctor," over and over before he finally asked why. Then when I told it was a snake bite, I misspoke due to how anxious I was. The cop told me to follow close behind him before jumping back in his car. The guy gave me and my friend a full police escort all the way to Yuma, where there was a fully equipped hospital and was ready to deliver the necessary anti-venom. Based on our description, a doctor quickly determined that my buddy had been stung by an Arizona bark scorpion. They delivered some pretty nasty stings as it is, but unless it's a kid that's unlucky enough to encounter one, the stings tend to be very painful but generally harmless. My buddy, however, was having an extreme reaction, and the doctor wanted to keep him in the hospital overnight, just in case he needed any further treatment. He spent most of the day either puking or just lying in bed too weak to do or say anything. The nursing team promised that he'd make it through, though, as there had only been 2 people killed by a bark scorpion since like the 60s, but I still couldn't quite shake the fear that something would go wrong and that he'd somehow pass away during the night. I wasn't allowed to stay in his room overnight, so I just slept in my car, but I was back in there first thing to hear the good news in the morning. My buddy was on his way to a full recovery, as all of his symptoms were subsiding, and by that afternoon, he'd been discharged with a pair of crutches. He wasn't happy to be hit with the medical bills, but he thanked me for getting him to the hospital on time. And I know he got in touch with the cop who pulled us over just to thank him for pulling us out of the fire when we needed it most. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, sleep tight, but don't let the ice picks bite.